Well, good afternoon. Today we're in Psalm 119, beginning in verse number 17. And the writer is actually praying for God to bless him and in a bountiful or an abundant way in order that he might keep the word of God. What is interesting, I think, in beginning this particular section of Psalm 119 is he may be asking in some ways for a physical blessing or some kind of physical circumstance, but its concern is for his spiritual welfare. So, beginning in Psalm 119, the writer says, "Deal bountifully, that is abundantly." He's asking for an abundant blessing with thy servant, that is his humble servant. That's how he approaches God in this prayer, that I might live. And let me just insert here that he might live worthy of God, worthy of the word of God. That's what Paul refers to in the book of Ephesians, that we walk worthy of our high calling. And so he says that I may live, and I want to stress, live in a way that's pleasing to God by keeping his word. In verse number 18, he says, open my eyes. Now, you remember Paul had said in Acts chapter 17 in verse 11 about those over in Berea, in that they were more noble or honest than those that were at Thessalonica, in that they received with readiness of mind, that they searched the scriptures daily to see whether these were so. Well, what are we talking about? Some people cannot see the wonderful things of the Bible because their minds are blinded. That's what Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, where he talks about a veil is still covering their eyes. And in that context, he's talking about the Jews that were holding on to the law, and that was blinding them to the truth of the gospel. And so what happens is sometimes our minds are blinded by tradition, and they're blinded by presupposition, and they're blinded by prejudice. There's just a bunch of things that blind us from seeing the truth. And what he's saying here is to open my eyes so I can see, that I may behold the wonderful things of the law or the word of God. Now, that's an interesting thought, and we don't have time to really go with this, but it's interesting, I think, is sometimes we fail to see the wonderful things that God has promised us, the wonderful blessings that we have, because we have not, our eyes are not open to that. In verse 19, watch it here. I'm a stranger in the earth. Now, if you're a stranger, and few of us really confess that, but if you're a stranger, let's say in some remote part of the world or in some culture that you're not accustomed to, things might seem strange to you. And what he's saying here is he's a stranger in that he is a man of God, and everything that surrounds him, you see, is not for God. And that's all he's saying here. I'm a stranger on the earth. He's not simply saying he's passing through, but he's a stranger, and what he wants to say is hide not my commandments, because you see, if you're in a pagan land and you're in a culture that does not respect God, everything is contrary to that. And so he's speaking as a stranger in the world, and that's why he says, hide not your commandments from thee, even though you may be in a godless world. Notice verse number 20. My soul breaketh for the longing. Now notice the idea here. He's talking about a longing. I mean, an earnest desire, and it's almost even an excessive desire that has unto thy judgments or pronouncements at all time. In verse number 21, thou hast rebuked the proud that are cursed, that is they're punished, which do err from thy commandments. Now again, I think what the writer is referring to is in this strange land, which he's a stranger in, there are all kinds of things that make it difficult to live the Christian life, the morals and the values. And here there are wicked men, you see, that you have to be confronted by, and he doesn't want those things to hinder him from walking with God. And that's why he says in verse number 22, remove from me reproach and contempt, those things that would hinder him, for I have kept thy testimonies. Listen, we live in a world where there's all kinds of temptations. There's all kinds of things to lure us away from God. We kind of make all kinds of excuses why we cannot attend to the things of God, and we're living in that kind of world. I think it's good that we recognize that we live in a world that makes it difficult sometimes to walk with God, and he's asking to be blessed that doesn't happen. Princes, here you go, rulers who sit and speak against me. See how difficult that would be, especially if you live in a country that is really against God. And then he says here, let thy servant meditate. And we talked a whole lot about meditating on the Word of God, and so we won't address any more of that right now. But notice this, and again, thy testimonies, he's talking about, the Word of God here, also are my delight. They're not burdensome. Even sometimes folks that say they follow Christ, they look at the whole business as a burden to them. If they have to attend church or they have to do anything that the Lord wants them to do, it's a burden. They don't want to get involved and they don't want to participate. And so everything you see about the whole business is a burden to them. It reminds me of Isaiah 1. They're talking about going to the assembly, you see, and they can't wait till it's over, and they can't wait till they get back to business, and they just hate to even be there. To them, it's almost even a waste of time. And that's a pretty bad attitude to have, isn't it? That's because sometimes our eyes are not really open, and we're living in a strange land, you see, that is anti-God, and everything that we're surrounded with is luring and pulling us away. That's why he's asking for a blessing, and we ought to ask for that blessing too, that we keep the commandments of God, and we just see how wonderful it is to be a follower and a Christian. And so those are some thoughts today, and I hope that they're helpful to you. Notice this. He said, they're a delight to me. And listen, that needs to be cultivated, doesn't it? To where we delight and have pleasure and joy in the Word of God. And that's a good thing to think about. So we'll continue our study tonight. Hope you'll be back with us in the evening. And then we'll be looking at Psalm 119 tomorrow again. So see you then.